Right. So we were talking about uh, the first unit in the earlier classes of women and writing, writing self, the woman question, personal is political. Right. Now coming to now next, but before I start the session, I would like to touch upon the very first unit, that is writing self under women and writing. So as per the request of the students, I'm just looking back into the writing self, which I've already dealt with it, but just a glimpse of it. So before I move on to, let me again give you a review of what all units we'll be doing here. That is block one, women and writing, block two, subverting the canon, block three, intersectionalities, and block four, feminist thought, and block five, the contemporary. So here in block one, I think we've already completed in the last class, but then I just wanted to take up the women in writing unit one, that is writing self. After which I would come back to the second block. Okay, so writing self. So let me just share the PPT. Right. So here, so basically women and writing, under which I would like to take up writing self. And here we are going to understand the importance of self writing in women's writing. Okay. And then also the actual concept of what exactly is self writing and the purpose which it served for women. And also, we would also throw some light on the theoretical issues in women's self writing. So, to start with, let me just give you a brief intro about it. Uh, Victorian novelist Charlotte Bronte. So, she had written to Robert Southey, the poet laureate of England, seeking his advice about some poetry she had written. So, in his letter, Southey not only held that literature was not meant to be a woman's business, but also that it took her away from her proper wifely duties. Now, why this, I think you can figure it out, like women were not encouraged to pen down any of the literature. So it was not meant for women. That is how it sounds, right? Then this had been the prevailing opinion about writing as a profession for women for a long time. So femininity was associated with silence and modesty, and writing was supposed to destroy these feminine virtues. And if you can see the slide here, the Victorian age, where, and women were treated like the angel of the house or a kind of a doll. And then now, another aspect. So then women could not and did not stop writing in spite of all those hurdles. And then many women like Pilkington, the 18th century Anglo-Irish poet, described their desire to write and their scribbling itch as an incurable disease. So whatever society told them, these women couldn't keep the pen out of their hands. Now, denied other channels of communication, it was to their journals, diaries, and letters that they turned to write. That is why, when it comes to early writings by women, we have to turn to women's self writing. Right. Now, before going into that, let me just talk about the anxiety of authorship. Now, what is this anxiety of authorship? Like, of course, early women faced a lot of difficulties, to be a writer. I mean, to write some piece of work, they had face a lot of difficulties. Right. Now, then this kind of a fear, they called it as anxiety of authorship. Now, then this anxiety of authorship, now it was because a woman was considered as somebody who's monstrous if she did not conform to the passive angel in the house role that society expected. So, and so in the place, women felt very anxious just trying to be an author. So they felt an anxiety of authorship. So a woman's anxiety of authorship is a fear that she isn't capable of writing at all, that she will never be a predecessor. Then Now, however, the earliest female writing pioneers like Afra Ben, Mary Shelley, George Eliot, the Bronte sisters, and Jane Austen somehow overcame this anxiety of authorship and wrote. Now, it seems that today women have a number of successful foremothers to rely on. Now, Gilbert and Gabber's idea of the anxiety of authorship came from the feminist movement of the 1970s. Where does this 21st century woman writer slip into this theory? So now there are many aspects of the fantasy genre that contribute to anxiety of authorship. Many women fantasy writers feel. Now, it was until the 20th century that women won the right to vote and have equal access to educational opportunities. And women writers were often marginalized or pushed to the sidelines and not given as much attention to or respect as male writers. Through this presentation, you should learn some facts about women writers throughout history and their contributions to writing and the world. Now, the women of the 19th century faced overwhelming obstacles. However, they fought back. When the weapon was a pen, the impact could be revolutionary. Now, another aspect is, as we all know, this anxiety has come up just because they were not allowed to write. All the writings about women were by men. And this imbalance of power comes up in the 18th century novel Persuasion, written by one of the most famous English women novelists, Jane Austen. Now, the male protagonist of Captain Havel argues that women are inconstant and claims as proof all the writings about women in history. Now, Anne Elliot, the female protagonist, refutes his argument by pointing out that the pen has always been in male hands. Now, she also remarks her remark implies that women were excluded from authorship and were also subject to male authority. Now, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guber observed that women in patriarchal societies, lacking the pen to write their stories, reduced to mere properties to characters and images imprisoned in male texts by male expectations and designs. Now, given the difficulties women encountered, when they decided to write, it was no surprise that privacy became a precondition of women's literary development. Accordingly, journals, diaries, and letters became the few forms that literary women could adopt. Now, these were perceived as less shameful than writing poetry or polemic genres reserved for men, where a female writer could be seen as competing against men and disowning her femininity. Diaries and journals also helped women express the anger and sadness at being confined to homes, while men could pursue professions and pursuits and depict their inner lives, which were too often in danger of misinterpretation in male writings. Now, let me just tell you as to why women were discouraged. Just a quick recap, because writing was considered unfeminine and it was believed that it took women away from their proper womanly duties. And then again about the anxiety of authorship. What does it mean? It's a concept which was introduced by Gilbert and Gilbert to refer to the anxiety early women writers felt regarding writing, which was considered as masculine. They had no literary foremothers to look up to, and writing was seen as dangerous to their femininity. Right. Now, if you look at the slide here, uh, this is what they believed in, that the women get married and the men would take care of them. And before the 1882 Married Property Act, when a woman got married, her wealth was passed on to her husband. Even if she worked after marriage, her husband would earn her wages. Well, can you hear my voice? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, hello. I see Nikhil and Sophia here, just like the last class. But let me clarify again. This is the fifth semester women's writing in English, and this is an elective course B. Because last time I remember you just logged out saying that this was not your elective. So I just wanted to ask you, is it the right platform you've joined?
नहीं मैम,
No?
वो हम लोग के पास लिंक ही मतलब नहीं है मैम, कोर्स ए की।
कोर्स ए मतलब आपका कौन सा है बेटा? कोर्स ए का कौन सा है आपका? टाइटल बोलो आप।
टाइटल मैम एक मिनट
हाँ।
अभी बोल। ये
हम्म।
इंडियन लिटरेचर इन इंग्लिश मैम, कोर्स डिसिप्लिन स्पेसिफिक इलेक्टिव कोर्स ए।
ओके, बट देन ये थर्ड सेमेस्टर का है क्या?
नो मैम, फिफ्थ सेमेस्टर का ही है।
फिफ्थ है?
यस मैम।
अच्छा, बिकॉज आई रिमेम्बर सोफिया है ना आपका नाम?
जी मैम।
हाँ, मैं अभी जो प्लेटफॉर्म में मैं लॉग इन हुई थी, वो वहां भी बच्चे वेट कर रहे थे एंड दे सेड दिस इज व्हाट इंडियन हिस्ट व्हाट वाज इट? व्हाट इज द टाइटल यू टोल्ड मी जस्ट नाउ? इंडियन।
डिसिप्लिन स्पेसिफिक।
हाँ, they were also waiting for the same. So maybe there's a different link for your course, I think so, Sophia.
यस मैम,
So there's
आई
no
थिंक।
point in being here in this. Maybe you can just try out
यस मैम।
elsewhere it is going on. Yeah, elsewhere it is going on. I think you also, Nikhil.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. No,
I am
because this.
also Indian literature in English, ma'am.
So this is what they have given me, women's writing in English, and that's an elective course of B. So
Okay, ma'am.
last time also I remember you logged in and then again you logged out. So I
Yes,
wanted to
ma'am.
make sure that you are in the right this thing or not. So why don't you talk to your coordinators about the link, ma?
We don't
हम
know number, ma'am.
नहीं मैम, नंबर नहीं है वो लोग का हम लोग के पास। हम लोग को
हाँ।
यही लिंक मिले तो इसीलिए हम लोग फिर यही लिंक पे ज्वाइन हुए।
अच्छा,
Yes, ma'am.
तो आप एक
Uh,
बार मेरे को आपका कोर्स डिटेल्स और कौन कौन सा सेमेस्टर है, आप एक बार मेरे को चैट बॉक्स में मैसेज करो बेटा। आई विल ट्राई टू फिगर इट आउट फ्रॉम माय मैम।
ओके मैम। मैम आपका मतलब नंबर दे सकते हैं, मतलब अभी इस पे से तो चले जाएंगे ना हम लोग को क्लास होने के
नहीं
बाद
नहीं
में।
नहीं नहीं बेटा, चैट पे डाल दो, आप चैट पे डाल दो एक बार।
ओके।
चैट पे डाल
ठीक।
दो आपका कोर्स
another link
टाइटल।
is another link is there, ma'am. But
हाँ,
to yesterday class was not
but today
continued,
it is
madam.
happening. Today it is happening.
Okay, madam. I will go.
I logged there. I saw the class was happening. And Nikhil, can you please share the same link with Sophia also? Maybe in the chat box, if you can share that link, she'll also try to join, Noma.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. Now, if you don't find the class in that link, you just come back. I will try to figure it out where I can reach it out. Okay? Yeah. Put it in the chat box so that she will also join. So the idea that women could get married and the men would take care of them. And as we all know, her wealth also was passed on to her husband. And now upper and middle class women were seen as dependent on men. And women were expected to have a moral duty towards their husband, families, and society, living and working based on evangelical beliefs about the importance of the family, the constancy of marriage, and uh, women's innate moral goodness. And also the clothing, which represented a woman's social status during the Victorian period and was highly contrasted among the different social classes. So attitudes towards women were also based upon what they were wearing. Right. Now, again, just a quick recap. Now, it was believed that writing was not only unfeminine, but that it took a woman away from her proper wifely duties. Yet, women could not stop writing. Denied other channels of communication, it was to their journals, diaries, and letters that they turned to write. And that is why, when it comes to early writings by women, we have to turn to women's self writing. Now, these were perceived as less shameful than writing poetry or polemic genres reserved for men, when a female writer could be seen as competing against men and disowning her femininity. I think, have you got it, Ma? Sophia?
Yes, ma'am.
Try joining that. Yeah. So then coming to many thinkers have moved away from the traditional humanist notion of the self as an autonomous, coherent, and completely individual entity, and toward the view that the self is partially socially constructed through language and other forms of social organization. Now, contemporary scholars prefer the terms self-writing and life writing to the traditional genre of autobiography. There have been three issues when it comes to recovery of women's early autobiographical writings. The clear lack of any stable form of self-writing, which relates to a wider unfixity or of genres in the past, women's ambiguous status as subjects, and the incomplete recovery of early modern women's writings. Although women have written autobiographically for many centuries and published autobiographies throughout the 20th century that are widely read, the criticism of women's autobiography as a genre is recent. Now, this autobiographical writing never taken seriously as a focus of study before the 70s was not deemed appropriately complex for academic studies. Now, those who took autobiography seriously restricted their focus to the lives of great men whose writings were taken as the prototypical formula for autobiographical writing. Now, one of the major theoretical explorations in women's self-writing has been about the psychological category of sexual difference and its significance in formulating what it means to be a woman. Nancy Chodorow, a psychologist specializing in ego psychology, took existing analysis of the basic sex differences in personality between girls and boys and postulated that feminine personality comes to define itself in relation and connection to other people more than masculine personality does. Right. Let us now move on to the woman speak, that is the second block and the fourth unit. What exactly does it comprise of? It introduces a concept such as écriture féminine that describes women's writing as unique since women are forbidden from writing and their expression is subjected to surveillance and censorship. So it points out how women's writing questions the man-centric language, giving examples from Lucille Rigare to Virginia Woolf. So the woman speak. Let us start with the woman speak. Now here we're going to talk about whether the question of language, is it man-made? And the language reforms, what were the language reforms which were involved to remove sexism in language? Explore the history of a woman's sentence. Now become familiar with the concept of a woman's language and the limitations of a distinct woman's language. Now, it was the linguistic activism associated with the women's movement starting in the 70s that posed the first major female challenge to male dominance in language. Women of all walks of life started to expose the biased portrayal of the sexes in language use and demonstrated that this portrayal was particularly discriminatory and damaging to women. Now here in this block, we are going to debate. I mean, it is like something where it discussed the debate about whether the language we use itself is man-made and also the certain language reforms that try to correct the sexism in language. So it also discussed attempts made by critics to invent a distinct tradition of women's language. So there have been arguments that since men have power, they control language, and therefore it is challenging for women to use this man made and man controlled language. Now, Virginia Woolf's idea of the woman's sentence was based on the assumption that women writers had the tough task of using an inherited male sentence, which foiled their attempts to be original. It was when they created and developed the more loosely structured woman's sentence that they came into their own. However, this idea has been criticized for uh, essentializing femininity. Similarly, there were also attempts made by French feminists like uh, Lucille Rigare and Helen Sixtus to invent a woman's language which they associated with distinct women's experiences centered on the body. However, these attempts have also been categorized as re entrenching essentialist stereotypes about women. Now, it also has been argued that it is impossible for anyone to speak outside the structure of language or society. Now, why do feminists object to he as an universal pronoun? It is because the feminists object to he as a personal pronoun as they feel it contributes to making women invisible. That is, to obscuring women's importance and distracting attention from their existence. Now, what is the issue feminists find with words like lady doctor? Now again it again shows that it is like, um, there is a kind of a discrimination, a differentiation, and that's how they have rejected the use of such words that mark the sex of the individual, like the lady doctor or actress, as they feel that the use of these terms are premised on the idea that maleness is the norm and that women filling these jobs are somehow deviant versions of doctors and actors. Now, the significance of coining a word that matters to women like sexual harassment. Now, the term sexual harassment is a recent feminist innovation, like Eve teasing, which was widely used previously, reduced the significance of the sexually abusive remarks or actions women faced in public, from strangers to the harmless act of teasing between friends. Once the problem was named, it became much easier to fight sexual harassment, both legally and by educating people about it. Now, here we also have a reason why English is said to encode a male point of view. The English language is so widespread that the language itself can be said to be male. English, in other words, encodes a male worldview by helping to subordinate women or to render them invisible, or by taking males as the norm. So, coming to Virginia Woolf and the woman's sentence. And writing in 1975 about the developments that were later to be called the new French feminisms, the critic Shoshana Fellman emphasized the radical nature of their linguistic project. She felt the challenge before a woman was to reinvent language so that it would not only speak against a patriarchal structure defined by the fallacy of male meaning, but which would also be outside this structure. The portmanteau term fallacy, which combined phallus or the and fallacy or an error, is in logical reasoning meant a false reasoning that was based on the phallus or rather a male point of view. So one of the debates which is long standing within feminist literary analysis is which are significantly different in terms of language from those of males. And it actually triggered with the work of Virginia Woolf when she asserted that there was a sentence which women writers had developed. She termed it the female sentence or the sentence of the feminine gender as opposed to the male sentence they had inherited. Now, Virginia Woolf's reflections on the woman's sentence came at a time when there were male critics like Arnold Bennett making broad claims about women's inability to produce great literature because of their biology. So therefore, for Woolf, it is necessary that women craft their own type of language. So she also suggests that the male sentence was insufficient for women writers. The example of the male sentence which Woolf gives is the grandeur of their works was an argument with them not to stop short, but to proceed. Here, Woolf seems to be arguing that males write it in a more formal mode than women, using nouns rather than verbs or adjectives. So the parallel phrasing of not to, but to also has a very formal feel to it. It's also a very impersonal statement, partly because of the use of nouns, which lead to the omission of agency, that is, of those who created the works in the above sentence. Now, she also argued that as opposed to many earlier women writers, Jane Austen was able to shape the common English sentence that was passed down from male writer to male writer and make it into a woman sentence. She also remarked in a review of a novel by her contemporary Dorothy Richardson that Richardson had developed, if not invented, the psychological sentence of the feminine gender. She defines this female sentence as of a more elastic fiber than the old, capable of stretching to the extreme of suspending the frailest particles, of enveloping the vaguest shapes. For Woolf, it is necessary that women craft their own type of language. Then moving on to the next unit, that is breaking the stereotypes. Now let us understand the concept of the canon in women's writing. Now, and also the history of canon formation in English literature. And also when and why, let us understand when and why women writers started challenging the male canon. And some writers from the female canon will also be studied here in this unit. And we will get to know about attempts to move away from canon formation. Now, the word canon comes from the word canon, which means a measuring rod. So the canon originally was used to distinguish authentic works of the Bible from spurious or apocryphal versions. but gradually it was defined more broadly to mean good literature. In fact, the best literature, that which was worth preserving and passing on from one generation to the next. In uh, in the history of literature, a number of authors and poets are considered as forming the canon, which in turn have been used as a yardstick to evaluate the works of succeeding generations of writers. Now, for example, the English playwright Shakespeare's plays have become the canon to judge other plays in English. So basically, what is canon? It's a measuring rod, it's a yardstick. Okay. And And here it talks about the best literature that is worth preserving, which is passed from generation to generation. Now, if you look at the best canonical writer, then Shakespeare can stand for it. Okay. Now, moving on to the canon formation. Now, canons are formed in different genres and literatures in different periods. And one of the ways in which canons are formed is through the establishment of certain writers as important literary figures through their inclusion in literary anthologies. Now, this publication of anthologies of poetry began in earnest in the 18th century. The final quarter of the 18th century saw the appearance of the first multi-volume compilations of English poetry, including John Bell's The Poets of Great Britain, complete from Chaucer to Churchill, and its English rival, the works of the English poets, boasting biographical prefaces by the hand of Samuel Johnson. Now, one striking fact about these works is that none admits even a solitary woman poet. Now, as we've already discussed, women writers were excluded and their works weren't taken up for publication. So this exclusion of women writers became a more significantly political act in the Victorian period, as the teaching of English language and literature came to be associated with propagating English values in an era of high colonialism. The Victorian period also witnessed the decline of traditional religion after the growth of science, especially Darwin's theory of evolution. So, in place of religion, which had previously held English society together and shaped its values, cultural critics like Matthew Arnold posited English poetry or literature, which would spread culture among the masses. Arnold contributed to the formation of the literary canon by demarcating a chosen section, the highly instructed few, as possessing the capability to gain knowledge and truth. Now, this gave the privileged group in possession of culture and mystical power of transmitting education to the masses in their own arbitrary way. So, even if literature could provide the answers to the problems of the 19th century society, it definitely classified education as the prerogative of only a few people. The highly instructed few were going to be people who had the economic power to purchase education, the educated elite, because of their notions of excellence and privileges. Now, another important factor that allowed for the perpetuation of the canon was the influence of eminent literary personalities such as F.R. Lewis and T.S. Eliot in the first half of the 20th century. Now, this can be seen in the formation of one of the greatest canonical works of Lewis, the Great Tradition. As we have already discussed, a canonical work privileges certain texts as great literature and others as ordinary fiction that provides entertainment. So, as a result, when many subsequent anthologies of representative great works were made, female authors were excluded, other than celebrated authors like Jane Austen and George Eliot. Now, next move on to the questioning the male canon. Now, questions about why there were not enough women writers in literary anthologies or literature courses started occupying the minds of many women writers and thinkers. The writers Virginia Woolf, in a room of one's own, was one of the first to explore the near absence of literary foremothers in the history of English literature for emerging women writers. It led her to an investigation of the social and material conditions required for the writing of literature. Now, these conditions, leisure time, privacy, and financial independence, were important in all literary productions, but they were particularly relevant to understanding the situation of women in the literary tradition because women historically had been uniformly deprived of those basic prerequisites. And also, there have been subsequent studies on how difficult it was for a woman writer to emerge in history. So, in her polemical book, How to Suppress Women's Writing, Joanna Russ points out that the old fashioned ways of denying female creativity were brutal and overt. Women were not taught to read and write. Women were excluded from the clubs and societies where literature was discussed. Women were discouraged from developing their talent because it would get in the way of their God given role as daughters, wives, and mothers. Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life and ought not to be. The poet laureate Robert Southey wrote to Charlotte Bronte in an infamous letter. The more she is engaged in her proper duties, the less leisure she will have for it. Now, while Virginia Woolf tried to give visibility to a number of overlooked women writers like Afra Ben and Margaret Cavendish in a room of one's own, it were scholars in the second half of the 20th century who tried to make many of these neglected writers and their writings accessible. Now, let us move on to the next recording Black women's experiences. While almost all the Anglo-American works mentioned were targeted at recovering white women's traditions, there have also been attempts to Black women writers to discover an alternate history of Black women's writings. Alice Walker had distanced Black women's writing from white feminism in her 1974 essay, In Our Mothers' Gardens, The Creativity of Black Women in the South. Walker brings in cases of artistically talented Black women from the generation of her mothers and grandmothers, such as the first African American woman to publish a book of poetry. Now, Walker, though tries to argue that Black women's creativity cannot be reduced to a mere bourgeois concept of writing, she argues from the vantage point of her mother's accomplishment as a gardener of unusual creativity that the Black woman's spirit was never broken. Black women gave expression to their creativity in various ways: quilt making, gardening, cooking. Now, these artists, Walker claims, are the progenitors of Black women's writing. Walker's Womanism, with its focus on the solidarity of the Black community, is a strong alternative to white feminism and greatly subverts conventional ideas about literature and writing, tracing the origin of women's writing to humble, homely chores Black women performed. Now, when we talk about the Black women, they wrote at a time where they did not even have, uh, uh, when they did not even own their bodies. Now, white women needed a room of one's own and an income to write, while Black women wrote when they lived as slaves to white people. Now, how did they kind of express their creativity, the Black women, through homely chores like quilt making, gardening, and cooking? Then, well, when we talk about the Indian women writers, they have generally written about the problems faced by English educated women of the middle classes who, despite being literate and employed, often find themselves being treated like second class citizens in their own home. When you talk about the recording Indian women's experiences, it's like the image of women in fiction has undergone a change during the last 4 decades. Women writers have moved away from the traditional portrayals of enduring, self sacrificing women toward conflicted female characters searching for identity, no longer characterized and defined simply in terms of their victim status. So, in contrast to earlier novels, female characters from the 1980s onwards assert themselves and defy marriage and motherhood. And our recent writers depict both the diversity of women and the diversity within each woman, rather than limiting the lives of women to one ideal. The novels emerging in the 21st century furnish examples of a whole range of attitudes towards the imposition of tradition, and some offering an analysis of the family structure and the caste system as the key elements of patriarchal social organization. They also reinterpret mythology by using new symbols and subverting the canonical versions. In conclusion, the work of Indian women writers is significant in making society aware of women's demands and in providing a medium for self expression and thus a rewriting the history of India. So, with this, I end the session. Let us meet again in the next session. And that is on next Sunday. So that would be 25th February. And this is my earnest request. I want you all to look into the material before joining the session. Also, any doubts, you can please bring it or raise your doubts here, get clarification about your doubts here on the Zoom platform here. Thank you.